Okay, ladies, welcome to the third and final installment of our Chapter 5, Part 2 Prezi on God's prophets and the return from the exile. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about prophets. We're going to talk about Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, do a little review, and then talk about the return from the exile when King Cyrus comes along and brings the people back to Jerusalem. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's get started, shall we? I am on slide number 51, and that's where we're going to start today. So hopefully you have your notes out, and here we go. So just to get a little perspective on where the prophets fit into which part of the timeline. Okay, if you remember, King Solomon was the last king of the united monarchy, and because of his actions and the actions of his son, it caused the split of the kingdoms. Now, go back and try to figure out which kingdom Rehoboam was from. Alright, so let's move on. Remember, when the kingdom split, when there was a divide in the kingdoms actually became vulnerable to attack, and that's what happened. So in the northern kingdom, we're seeing a lot of injustice happening. There's a lot of syncretism and paganism, which is very similar, right? Paganism is the worship of other gods, and syncretism is the blending of both your religion and another religion. And that's what was happening in the northern kingdom in Israel. Okay? Lots of injustice, no concern for the poor, and these are where those prophets that we talked about last time come into play. Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, and Amos, and many more. Okay, so God sent many prophets into the kingdom of Israel to try to change their ways. But, as we know, ultimately Israel is taken by which kingdom? Assyria. You're right. So let's move forward. Now we're left with just the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, Judah seems better off than Israel was, okay, because they had this alliance with Assyria, but they still turned to the same sins as Israel did. Idolatry, syncretism, injustice, no concern for the poor. It was just the same old story, different kingdom. Okay, so here we enter in some of the major prophets we're going to talk about today. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. But we also see the prophet Micah coming in. He's a minor prophet. Now, as we know, towards the end of Judah's time, Judah is actually taken, and the temple and Jerusalem are destroyed, and they fall to Babylon. Very good. So then we enter the Babylonian exile, and this is when the people were taken away from their country, away from Judah, into Babylon, and were enslaved. Let's move on. So I'm actually not going to talk about these four prophets again, Hosea, Elijah, Elisha, and Amos, but take a moment to review each of these points. Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, and Amos. Okay, see what you remember from each of those. Now, we're going to talk about these three specifically today. Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. And these are three of the very, very major prophets. And remember, we call major prophets because they have a lot of writings about them. And Isaiah actually has the most writing about them. So, let's see. Isaiah is a major prophet, okay? And we're going to talk all about Isaiah. And Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, actually spans a long period of history, which is why it can't be written by the same person. And that's why we have three Isaiahs. Well, let's make some sense of this first, okay? So we're going to go through each Isaiah. Isaiah, the second Isaiah, which is a follower of Isaiah, and then third Isaiah, which is a disciple of the second Isaiah. Kind of confusing, but I think you can follow along. So let's start from the beginning. So first Isaiah, books 1 through 39, are the actual prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem. Okay, Isaiah 6, 1 through 9 actually talks about Isaiah's call narrative, and very similar to Moses' call narrative and all of the other ones you looked at in the second video. So that's the first Isaiah. Now, second Isaiah, 40 through 55, is a follower of the first Isaiah. We actually call second Isaiah Deutero-Isaiah, which just means second Isaiah. And we're going to come back to that in a second. And this is where you see the servant song. And there's so much connection to Jesus here in Isaiah 53. So take a moment, look up Isaiah 53 and read it and see what parts of Jesus you see, how you see Jesus coming into play there. All right, third Isaiah is actually a disciple of the second Isaiah. So these all come in at different points in history. So the first Isaiah is right at the beginning of the exile. Okay? Second Isaiah is during and at the end of the Babylonian exile. And then third Isaiah, as you see, is in Jerusalem after the exile, when the people are sent home. Okay, so it couldn't have been the same person because that's just too much time. Now let's take a look at this Deutero-Isaiah. This is where we're going to find a lot of the good stuff. Okay, so Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah, okay, it's just in this disciple, and he's writing these middle portions of the book of Isaiah. And he was at the end of this Babylonian exile, in the beginning of the Persian period. Okay, so he most likely witnessed King Cyrus's destruction of Babylon. So King Cyrus, the king of Persia, is the one who destroys Babylon and sends the people back to Jerusalem. Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. So 3 Isaiahs spanning 3 different periods of time. The first Isaiah is the actual prophet in Jerusalem at the beginning or before the beginning of the exile. Second Isaiah, the end of the exile, and third Isaiah when they come back to Jerusalem. So there is still that message of hope there. Now, let's take a look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel is also a major prophet, and he's a priest. He's actually the only prophet that's also a priest. And priests usually had an active role in the temple. So that's what a priest was. He made sacrifices and did a lot of other jobs at the temple. So he was the only prophet that is a priest. Kind of cool. So this is interesting. Ezekiel actually gets deported to Babylon with all of the people during the exile. Okay, so he is removed from Jerusalem. And the book of Ezekiel is filled with visions. Visions. Okay? Filled with visions. The first part is this impending doom of Jerusalem. You keep worshiping other gods. You keep mixing your religion with other gods. You keep having no concern for the poor, and you will be doomed. Your Jerusalem will be destroyed. And that's what those first chapters are about. Then we move on to Ezekiel's latter part of his chapters, okay, where he talks about these visions of restoration and this grand vision where Ezekiel sees a hopeful reestablishment of Israel. Really nice. Okay, but we also have to remember that there's some tie-in here to Lamentations. Realize how much Ezekiel suffered with the Israelites in Babylon. So this Babylonian exile wasn't something that should be taken lightly. Okay, we have so much suffering going on, and they're enslaved. And if you remember from when we talked about our Psalms, there's a hymnic psalm, which is what you guys did for your projects, but there's also songs of lament. Deep, deep sorrow. And so even though you're praying, that there's so much sorrow there. And that's what Ezekiel is able to express in his book and in Lamentations. Now, there's also some popular visions with Ezekiel that you may be familiar with, and especially the Valley of the Dry Bones. So, take a minute, find Ezekiel 37, and we're going to read parts of this together. Okay, let's take a look at Ezekiel chapter 37. Now, I've highlighted a couple passages here that I want to point out. So, this Valley of Dry Bones is an interesting story. And basically, it's about God bringing life to the people. So, Son of Man, can these bones come back to life? Okay, and Ezekiel's going to say, of course you can do that, Lord. He says, the Lord says, I'll put breath into you so you may come to life. Then you shall know I am the Lord. So he's breathing life back into him, almost like the creation story in Genesis. Okay, and at the very end you see, Son of Man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So the bones in this valley actually represent the house of Israel. They are saying, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off. Okay, they've been destroyed by these foreign countries, and they have no hope left. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord, look, I am going to open your graves. I will make you come out of your graves, my people, and bring you back to your land of Israel. You shall know that I am the Lord. Okay, so he's giving this message of hope, this Valley of Dry Bones, that Israel will be restored. Now let's move on to Jeremiah. Jeremiah, again, is a major prophet, and he actually is a prophet in Jerusalem, he doesn't go with the people who are in exile. He actually is remaining in Jerusalem. There's a very few people that remained in Jerusalem, and this is one of them. Now, if you notice here, it says Jeremiah remained in Jerusalem in Judea. What the heck is Judea? Let's make sure we know this, okay? We're now going to call Judah Judea. Okay, so it's the Aramaic name for the place formerly called Judah. Okay, so it was given this name after the Babylonian exile. Okay, and this, of course, Judea, which was Judah, includes which city? Jerusalem. Okay, so Jeremiah is going to stay in Jerusalem, and this is his initial message. Jeremiah is speaking to the people, and he's saying, Judea is paying the price for its sins. The people have been deported to Babylon, and you are here, and Judea is paying the price for its sins. So we must follow Babylon in order to save Jerusalem and to save the temple. So Jeremiah actually has a famous temple sermon in Jeremiah 7, and you can go and read that on your own, and I encourage you to do so. Okay, but in the temple sermon, he's warning the people of all the same sins we've seen over and over again. About the oppression, don't oppress the poor, reform your evil ways, proclaim this message from the temple. Okay, it was also an attack against the corrupt temple practices again. Now, 2 questions for you here, girls. Does this remind you of another prophet? Okay, go back into that second video and you'll see that this is actually another prophet, somebody who was preaching against the corruption of temple practices. And it should also remind you of an interesting event in the Gospels when Jesus actually goes into the temple and he flips over those tables and he calls the temple the den of thieves. So Jeremiah is very much like Jesus in that way. All right, so we're going to move on now to a little review, and then we're going to talk about the return after the exile. So if you remember, King Nebuchadnezzar invades and destroys Jerusalem and the temple, okay, in around 587, give or take a few years. Okay, so we now go into exile, where most of the people are deported and enslaved, okay, and some, with Jeremiah, stay in Judea and Jerusalem. So the difficulties of living in a foreign land is that they started to intermarry. So they didn't have an identity as God's chosen people anymore, but they also had no temple to worship in. Jerusalem was where the temple was, and the temple had been destroyed. So they had no temple to worship in, and that was really hard for them. So they began to preserve their prayer practices in other ways. They definitely continued to observe the Sabbath. Okay, that's one of the laws. They observed circumcision, and they started to meet in synagogues for study and prayer. So if you don't have a temple, now they actually have synagogues. So instead of one big major temple where everyone would come worship, now there's many different synagogues. And so life was a bit different during the exile. But let's see what happens after the exile. King Cyrus of Persia, if you remember, Persia on the map came from all the way down in the south by the Persian Gulf. Makes sense. Okay? King Cyrus actually conquers Babylon a couple years later. And this is interesting, ladies. King Cyrus could have just kept the people enslaved, but he actually gave an opportunity for all the enslaved peoples to return home. But here's the interesting thing. It wasn't that easy. Some people actually chose not to return to their home. And this is that diaspora that we're talking about, where people are displaced from their homeland, Israel, the Jewish people in particular, okay? But this is not the end of the exile. This is hard because even when they go back to Israel, they're still under foreign rule. It's going to be Persia, and then it's going to be Greece, and then it's going to be Rome. And so there's really never a time when they become completely self-ruled, and that's really hard for them as well. So this is an important lesson. God does not tolerate idolatry and pagan worship and syncretism. So the consequence is that they become this temple-centered people. So here's our conclusion. After the exile and the return to Jerusalem, the chosen people became temple-centered. Okay, where the temple became the focal point for their people. They actually rebuilt the temple when they got back to Israel. And this is that message of salvation. All right, girls, this is it. 3 videos. Chapter 5, Part 2, God's Prophets, and the Return of the Exile. Nice work.